Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Peter Husey, and I'm Senior Director of Deterrent Studies here at the Mitchell Institute, as well as President of Geostrategic Analysis. Thank you for watching this on-demand presentation, which is part of our 20th Nuclear Deterrent and Nuclear Triad Symposium, the title of which is Second to None, Working Together to Modernize America's Nuclear Deterrent. I'm happy to be co-hosting this symposium with our friends at the Cyber Innovation Center and Louisiana Tech Research Institute in Bossier City, Louisiana, and they work in association with Global Strike Command. We are very fortunate today to have a friend of mine and a colleague, Dr. Christopher Ford. He's from the Department of State. He will give us a preview of the issues to watch in arms control, nonproliferation, and disarmament. As I just said, he is Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Nonproliferation. In addition, he has delegated the duties of the Office of the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security. And he has a history as a diplomat, a National Security Council staffer, a Senate staff member, and a Navy intelligence officer. And he has a distinguished career in foreign affairs, national security, intelligence, nonproliferation, and arms control and verification. I want to welcome you, Dr. Ford, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to start today's session by giving you an opportunity to make a few remarks on arms control, nonproliferation, and disarmament challenges that face the United States. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Peter, for the kind introduction, and it is great to be back involved in yet another excellent Nuclear Triad Symposium. Thanks for all the work that you guys do in putting these together. In my current role, performing the duties of the Undersecretary, and in my years of government service, going back to the 1990s, I guess, I've always been a strong supporter of our country's nuclear deterrent, and it is therefore really gratifying to see such a stalwart crew come together so repeatedly and so consistently and effectively in events like this to compare notes and to help ensure that the policy community does not lose focus upon the imperative of preserving that deterrent. So thanks for all that you're doing. And that work is especially important, I think, as we look ahead to the strategic environment of 2021 and thereafter, and to the range of U.S. policy challenges that will face the Biden administration starting in January. Now, many of those challenges are quite obvious, and you don't need me or anyone to tell you what they are, but I thought it would be interesting and useful today to help frame and highlight some of those challenges by exploring a little bit some of the details of some of them that may perhaps not be quite so obvious from the outside. In particular, I'd like to flag a few of what I call issues to watch in assessing how seriously U.S. leaders approach their responsibilities as stewards of U.S. national security over the next 4 years. Time precludes going over all these issues here today with you, but I would encourage all of you all watching this broadcast to look out for another one in our Arms Control and International Security paper series that will come out on this topic of issues to watch in the next few days, which will enable readers and your viewers to walk through perhaps a longer list. But for the moment, I'd like to focus on, for this audience in particular, a few things that may be of particular special relevance to you all. First of all, I'd like to talk briefly about no first use or sole purpose nuclear weapons theory, if you will. Secondly, the issue of U.S. Nuclear warhead reductions. Third, the challenge of recapitalizing the U.S. nuclear weapons infrastructure. And fourth, the challenge of placing permanent limits upon Iran's nuclear capabilities. So let's start with no first use policy, or NFU. Now, I'd say the first thing to remember here is that a no first use policy is actually the same thing as a policy in which it is the sole purpose, so-called, of nuclear weapons to deter the use of other nuclear weapons. Both of these formulations regard nuclear weaponry as having no role in deterring anything other than nuclear weapons use by an adversary. So the terms are basically interchangeable and indistinguishable, and this is the intent, actually. As former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry has admitted, sole purpose is exactly the same thing as NFU, the sole purpose terminology having been dreamed up merely in order to sound less worrisome to American ears, for we in this country are suspicious traditionally of NFU, and for some good reasons, as I'll outline. So I would guess I would start by saying ignore the sleight of hand in the terminology. NFU is sole purpose, and sole purpose is NFU. But what were we to make of it on its merits? Concerned as they have been since the earliest days of the Cold War, with deterring not just nuclear weapons use against the United States or its military allies, but also with deterring large-scale conventional attack. US officials have shunned no first use for generations. We even avoided it during the early years of the post-Cold War era, when the United States' conventional military might allowed it to stand astride the global stage like some kind of colossus, and we faced very little direct conventional military threat indeed. So accordingly, one might think that in the present era, in which our great power competitors have been rapidly building up their conventional military power relative to our own, and they have actually started using that power to intimidate or even to invade neighbors that are friendly to the United States. In that era, you would think it would be extraordinarily important for Washington to continue to avoid no first use. As I pointed out elsewhere, the implications of a sole purpose declaration, or NFU policy, in other words, those implications would have been hugely significant as a blow to the heart of our alliance system, a potential signal to would-be regional aggressors, and also a signal to our friends that we don't intend to defend our alliance partners as we once did, and a repudiation of decades of bipartisan and transoceanic good sense and agreement upon one of the most important planks of US foreign and national security policy. So that's why our adversaries very much like the idea of the United States adopting a no first use policy. During the Cold War, for instance, NFU, or I guess at least an American NFU policy, was very attractive to the Soviet Union, which may have desired the comparatively free hand that NFU would have given it to threaten US allies in Europe and in the Far East with conventional attack without fear of US nuclear retaliation. Leonid Brezhnev, in fact, made NFU a plank of the USSR's disarmament diplomacy, such as it was, in 1982, thus demonstrating, to my eye, how NFU can actually undermine deterrence and stability, and how feel-good virtue signaling in nuclear policy can be weaponized for cynical ends. Today, it's the PRC, in fact, that tries to weaponize NFU among the credulous, as Beijing urges such a policy upon us, even though no one takes China's own NFU pledge terribly seriously, and there may be reason to think that it has been basically a fraud from the outset. Yet, despite all of this, NFU still has a lingering attraction in some US political circles, where some folks still seem to appear to think that we can safely adopt strategic policies on the basis of how good they make us feel about ourselves in our fidelity to the dream of disarmament, as if it were, for example, still, say, 1994, and one might perhaps be able, in theory, to argue that the only serious threat we and our allies faced from other powers was, in fact, their nuclear weaponry. So sole purpose thinking, as it turns out, actually appeared in President Obama's 2010 nuclear posture review. Now, of course, although that review made clear that the United States was not at that time prepared to adopt a universal policy, that deterring nuclear attack is the sole purpose of nuclear weapons, the 2010 NPR did promise to work to establish conditions, it said, under which such a policy could be safely adopted, in pursuit of what it said was the objective of making deterrence of nuclear attack on the United States or our allies and partners the sole purpose of nuclear weapons. Indeed, as recently as January of 2017, mere days before President Trump's inauguration, Vice President Joe Biden proclaimed his continued desire to adopt an NFU policy. Specifically, Vice President Biden declared his, quote, commitment to create the conditions by which the sole purpose of nuclear weapons would be to deter others from launching a nuclear attack, end quote. So I would suggest that that is a reason why NFU is a key issue to watch over the next few years, and a perspective through which one can perhaps evaluate the seriousness of the incoming US administration in strategic terms. I think personally that it would be ironic for a Biden administration, committed as its leaders claim to be to restoring US alliance relationships, in their words, it would be ironic for them to sabotage those very relationships through the existential betrayal of renouncing the extended nuclear deterrence upon which, for generations, we have relied to protect our allies and partners in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific from attack and invasion. So given Biden's January 2017 commitments, I have to say one cannot apparently rule that out, but I do suggest that it is a good issue to watch. So the second issue to watch that I'd like to flag for you today has to do with whether the United States will circle back to the Obama administration's idea that we can lead the way, as it was said, in getting rid of nuclear weapons. And if we do so, that others will follow. Now, it was certainly the case that as Cold War tensions waned, the United States was able safely to eliminate the vast majority of its nuclear weapons. And in some respects, the United States did indeed take the initiative in bringing this about. Beginning with the success of Ronald Reagan's INF Treaty in eliminating an entire class of nuclear delivery system, and following with the enormous reductions in strategic forces that were negotiated and thereafter carried out under George H.W. Bush's Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START, as well as the elimination of large numbers of non-strategic weapons under the presidential nuclear initiatives, enormous strides were indeed made in getting rid of weaponry that the end of Cold War tensions had made unnecessary. Today, as a consequence, the number of weapons in the US arsenal stands at its lowest point since the Eisenhower era. But these past successes have sometimes led US leaders to assume that if we simply want to enough, and if we show moral leadership in pointing the way there, that we can replicate such progress indefinitely, moving inexorably forward into a future world in which nuclear weapons have entirely disappeared. This was the promise held out, for instance, by President Obama in his Prague speech of April 2009, in which he declared that the United States has a moral responsibility to act in creating a world without nuclear weapons. And to this end, in 2013, President Obama proposed cutting our deployed strategic arsenal by an additional 1/3 to about approximately 1,000 operational warheads, even below the levels, of course, established by the New START agreement he signed in 2010. President Obama also unilaterally retired our sole remaining sea-launched nuclear cruise missile and proclaimed that the United States was ready to work with NATO allies to seek bold reductions in US and Russian tactical weapons in Europe. Now, all that is history and is well known, but I think it is a dangerously faulty syllogism to think that merely because A, we could do so much after the Cold War ended, that B, we can necessarily do more now. The problem, I think, is obvious. Our impressive post-Cold War reductions were feasible because Cold War tensions had waned. Whereas today, since the mid-2000s, the strategic environment has been getting worse, not better. This approach, having failed to catalyze disarmament movement even back in 2009, very difficult to see how that could in fact possibly work in the early 2020s. Even before the Prague speech in 2009, after all, the Putin regime in Moscow had begun secretly to violate the INF Treaty and had openly used military force to seize territory from one of its neighbors, the country of Georgia, and the PRC was itself engaged in a nuclear and conventional military buildup. Since then, Russia has stepped up its use of military aggression as a tool of territorial self-aggrandizement, seizing Crimea from Ukraine in 2014, and following that up with an invasion of the easternmost portions of the rest of Ukraine, all, of course, in grotesque violation of the United Nations Charter, not to mention the Kremlin's own promises in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 to guarantee Ukraine's territorial integrity. Even while interfering in the electoral processes of multiple Western democracies, Russia has maintained an illegal biological weapons program and has not merely retained an illegal chemical weapons program, but in fact used a chemical weapon on the soil of one of our NATO allies. Russian expeditionary forces today prop up the Syrian dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad, shielding it from accountability for ongoing chemical weapons atrocities, among many other things. For its part, the PRC continues to expand the military capabilities with which it seeks to overawe and to cow its neighbors. It engages in constant and egregious cyber-facilitated technology theft around the world. It issues steadily more bellicose threats against Taiwan, even while crushing the last vestiges of political freedom in Hong Kong and committing horrific industrial-scale abuses against Muslim and other minorities within the PRC. Beijing has also militarized and sought to seize control of the entire South China Sea in violation of international law. So I would say that continued progress on disarmament in this security environment is clearly much more challenging than it was in the mid-1990s, to say the least, let alone to imagine a resumption of the kind of giddily rapid movement of the early post-Cold War era. Nor, I should say, by the way, that all of those post-Cold War reductions, even they didn't entirely work in the first place. The Kremlin, for instance, never fulfilled its P&I promises to eliminate certain categories of its non-strategic weapons. Though, of course, the United States did fulfill all of its commitments. Today, as a result of Moscow's refusal to do so while we, in fact, did do what we promised, the Russians maintain a huge numerical advantage in non-strategic weaponry, which is projected to increase. And while we have not deployed a new strategic system for decades, much less an entirely new type of strategic nuclear system, Russia is building, and in some cases already deploying, bizarre new exotic systems, so-called. Most prominently, they are building the Poseidon nuclear-powered torpedo designed to inundate US coastal cities with radioactive tsunamis. They're building new hypersonic boost glide nuclear delivery vehicles and an air-launched ballistic missile, and of course, the madly reckless flying Chernobyl of the Skyfall nuclear-powered cruise missile. Meanwhile, China continues its nuclear buildup rather dramatically, not merely adding to the diversity of its delivery systems in pursuit of what will be at least a triad-type configuration, but also dramatically expanding the size of that arsenal, on the way to at least doubling the number of weapons in a few years' time. Beijing is also moving increasingly towards a launch-on warning posture, even while criticizing such a posture publicly, contemptuously dismissing any prospect of arms control negotiation with the United States, and resisting meaningful bilateral nuclear risk reduction talks as well. So this is the strategic environment that we face today. And this is why I see it as another issue to watch for all of you in the question of whether or not US leaders during the next 4 years try to circle back to earlier enthusiasms for the idea that the United States can lead disarmament by reducing our nuclear arsenal irrespective of security conditions. And I would say that the crowning irony here is maybe that President Obama's suggestion in 2013 that we reduce our arsenal to about 1,000 operational warheads fits remarkably well with the recent suggestion in a government-controlled newspaper owned by the Chinese Communist Party's official mouthpiece, People's Daily, that China itself needs an arsenal of about 1,000 operational warheads. So will President-elect Biden be willing to repudiate the Obama administration's warhead target that he supported in 2013? Or would he be willing to be the first US leader to endorse numerical parity with China? It certainly bears watching. So my third issue has to do with the US nuclear weapons infrastructure. And when it comes to the future of the US deterrent, one needs, I would argue, to look beyond just the famous triad of land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and strategic bombers. In particular, I would say that our deterrent also depends critically upon the infrastructure that builds, maintains, and must be relied upon if needed to replace the actual nuclear weapons that it is the job of such delivery systems to be able to deliver, and without which those delivery systems are no more than fancy and expensive ways of making pieces of metal travel for long distances. So here is then, I think, another important issue to watch and a test of strategic seriousness for future US leaders. As I've long emphasized, the US nuclear weapons infrastructure has a vital role to play in maintaining deterrence. This is a point that many observers, I believe, commonly tend to forget in assessing nuclear strategy. Having a robust and an effective nuclear weapons infrastructure is vital if you are to maintain any meaningful deterrence over time. And it is also of enormous importance in deterring breakout from arms control agreements and in avoiding the dangerous spiral of an unconstrained nuclear arms race. Your adversary, in a competitive context, for instance, does not need to know only that your existing weapons will ensure that aggression would exact from him an entirely unacceptable cost. The adversary also needs to know that you can keep him in this position of being deterred for as long as you need to, regardless of what he does. And this is the role of the nuclear weapons development and production infrastructure. A robust infrastructure tells the adversary that he cannot outbuild and overwhelm you in an arms race. And maintaining such an infrastructure thus contributes both to baseline deterrence and to preventing treaty breakout and arms race. Now, I would say this is particularly important because it is through decay of the underlying nuclear infrastructure that dangerously premature nuclear disarmament is most likely to occur by stealth, as it were, or by thoughtless inadvertence. To my eye, it is unlikely that any US president would be bold and foolish enough to forego the maintenance of a robust suite of strategic delivery systems themselves. Such arms are, well, after all, well known to everyday Americans. Decrepitude and dysfunction here in that area would be shockingly obvious to everyone, and the loss of those capabilities would be both obvious and obviously gravely detrimental to US security. But the gradual collapse and debilitation of the underlying nuclear weapons infrastructure is not nearly so easy to see. and it is all too easy to permit. It is lamentably easy and simple to skimp on infrastructure, for it is expensive and its importance is not always obvious, especially to the layman, and the damage that can occur from its decrepitude is of a sort that is neither immediate nor intuitively apparent in the way that would be, for example, a bomber that couldn't fly. So cutting corners in infrastructure is easy to overlook, it is easy to rationalize, and the costs of doing all this are sometimes hard to see, especially to non-experts. And we know, by the way, that letting the infrastructure deteriorate in such a fashion, we know this is easy because past US presidents and Congresses of both political parties have already allowed all too much such damage to occur. Today, over half of the US National Nuclear Security Administration's facilities in this regard are now more than 40 years old, and about a third of them actually date back to the Manhattan Project itself. To anyone serious about deterrence, especially over time, this is unconscionable. So to help turn this around, the current US administration has allocated considerable amounts of money in the fiscal year 2021 budget to help recapitalize the US nuclear infrastructure. But this will need sustained attention for a long time if we are to be able to meet our national security needs in the future, let alone to be able to develop new capabilities in the event that worsening strategic circumstances so demand. And this makes maintenance of the infrastructure, to my eye, a truly vital issue to watch for the next administration. Will the United States continue on the path of recapitalization and revitalization that we are setting, or will we in this country, in some fit of inattention or penny pinching, will we quietly throw in the proverbial strategic towel? Very much, I think, an important issue to watch. And finally, let me point to the question of the challenge of putting limits on Iran's nuclear program. Now, it is, of course, all but a certainty that the incoming US administration will profess a commitment to returning to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran. And it is very likely that the new administration will seek to provide Iran some degree of relief from the punishing and highly effective US sanctions imposed upon Iran over the last 4 years. But a much more interesting question, in a sense, and another one of my issues to watch, therefore, is not how quickly the Biden administration rushes into anti-Trump virtue signaling through effusive praise of the JCPOA, but rather whether the president-elect has any plan to address the key nonproliferation threat that is actually written into the JCPOA itself, and whether the administration can implement a plan to meet this threat without adopting what is, in essence, the JCPOA policy of the Trump administration. So the key thing to remember here is that although the JCPOA did delay Iran's development of fissile material production capabilities and stockpiles of enriched nuclear material, this was merely a delaying tactic. Under the terms of the nuclear deal, key restrictions on Iran's nuclear program will evaporate, leaving Iran free, for instance, to build the 190,000 separative work unit enrichment capacity for uranium, for which Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, called in 2014, describing that as Iran's absolute need, in his words. Indeed, under the terms of the JCPOA, Iran will eventually be free to build an enrichment capacity of any size and to possess as much enriched uranium as it wishes, even if that material were enriched to bomb-grade levels of purity. In another 4 years, for instance, JCPOA restrictions will start to ease on Iran's manufacture of advanced uranium centrifuge production, of advanced uranium centrifuges, such as the IR-6 and IR-8 models. All limits on centrifuge production would disappear a couple of years later, and Iran would also thereafter be able to possess as much enriched uranium as it wished, albeit at that point only up to an enrichment level of 3.67% of U-235. In about a decade, however, Iran would be free to enrich that uranium stockpile to a weapons optimal level of 90% or so if it wished, and would be free, in fact, to do so anywhere in Iran, rather than solely at the quite well-known and not terribly well-protected facility at Natanz. Furthermore, there is ambiguity in the JCPOA on other issues, creating the danger, for instance, that Iran will feel free, again, after a while, to continue to go back to building heavy water nuclear power reactors optimized for plutonium production, and would feel free also to reprocess spent fuel from its reactors, thus giving itself a potential pathway to a plutonium weapon and not merely a uranium bomb. So let me be clear. This dystopian future of an Iran that is postured for the option of a quick potential sprint to nuclear weaponization and the production of a sizable nuclear arsenal, that dystopian future is not one that the JCPOA prevented. To the contrary, it is one that the JCPOA accepted and legitimized, and to which Britain, France, Germany, China, Russia, and the Obama administration agreed. And this is why I think the JCPOA is such an important issue to watch beginning in 2021, for reasons that go far beyond just whether or not the new administration will return to the deal. To be sure, the conundrum that the Biden administration will face is a challenging one. I certainly don't deny that, because the problem itself is in the terms of the JCPOA, as I've outlined. Under that deal, the other participants promised to lift nuclear sanctions on Iran upfront in return for Tehran's agreement to abide by the terms of the deal. And for a while, that was felt to be a good idea, for those terms actually did, and still do, put limits on the size and scope of Iran's nuclear program. But the problem comes in those few years' time, as I have outlined, when the terms of the deal itself will allow Iran to expand its fissile material production capabilities as much as it wants. On the other hand, to put new pressures on Iran in order to get it to agree to additional restrictions would be to violate the JCPOA. So accordingly, the JCPOA's supporters are a bit stuck. They would seem to have only two choices. They can break away from their cherished JCPOA by putting nuclear pressures on Iran to agree to a more enduring deal, or they must resign themselves to accepting the huge future Iranian fissile material program that their beloved agreement would permit. They cannot be faithful to the JCPOA without agreeing to let Iran have those capabilities, and they cannot pressure Iran to agree to permanent limits without admitting that the Trump administration was right all along about the JCPOA's sunset clause. So I don't envy them this dilemma. It is a challenging one, but I do urge the new administration thoughtfully to review the full range of current information about the Iranian nuclear program when they have access to all the intelligence sources, and to seek a new agreement that comprehensively addresses the wide range of threats that emanate from the Iranian regime in this respect and in other ways. And this, I think, is another, and for the moment, final issue to watch for the next administration. So I personally, in my role now, of course, have no way of knowing exactly what the Biden administration will do in these various areas. And I presumably will not be in office to find out. But I do hope that my outline today of issues to watch, as well as the additional points that I will be putting into our forthcoming ACES paper, I hope that these will give you all some useful substantive reference points to keep an eye on as things develop. So once again, Peter, thanks for letting me be a part of this great program, and I look forward to our discussion.
Chris, I have to say, as usual, very sobering, and I'm going to use each of your points and ask you one question of each of them. On no first use or sole use, would you elaborate on how our allies, not just in Europe, but Asia, particularly South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, look at such an issue? Because, as you mentioned, there has been an emphasis in the media, in academic work, and critiques of the current administration that we didn't cooperate enough with our allies. Now, whether one thinks that is true or not, Victor Davis Hanson has an extraordinarily good essay just recently about, kind of takes that argument apart. But let's go with it. How do our allies look at the idea of an America that would say we're adopting a no first use policy? And not only Europe, but also if you'd address how our Asian allies would look at this too.
Well, as someone who has in fact talked with our allies about these sorts of issues, I probably should, given my role as a U.S. diplomat, refrain from speaking sort of for them or recounting conversations with them. That wouldn't be fair or appropriate. But let me try to answer your question obliquely by offering what I would think if I were them. And since I'm not them, you can take that for whatever it is or isn't worth, and they may have different views in practice, who knows. But if I were in their shoes, it would worry the heck out of me. For many of the reasons that I outlined in my remarks, in the sense that maybe you could have had a conversation circa the mid-1990s about that. It's like, oh gosh, I'm really worried that you are abandoning the idea of using nuclear weapons to deter conventional aggression against me. But I know that you, in the sort of post-Cold War context, Mr. United States, are so big and so powerful, and your conventional forces are literally just unmatched in the history of humanity, that, if it really came to it, if I were subjected to massive conventional threats from, say, China or Russia, yeah, under those circumstances, I'm pretty confident you could handle that without the use of nuclear weapons. So I guess I'm okay with that. But the implied parenthetical at the end of that response to my American counterpart in that hypothetical discussion is that, I'm okay with that as long as those strategic circumstances continue to be the case. And by the way, in 2021, those are certainly not the case. Unfortunately, would that they were, but they're not. And so I think it would be enormously caustic and dangerous to our alliance structures to abandon any commitment to potentially using nuclear weapons to deter aggression in that sort. We've relied upon that for a great many years, and to walk away from that now would be a terrible blow to our alliance relationships. I would also add just quickly, I think it might also be a very dangerous step from a non-proliferation perspective, because if after that conversation with my American counterparts, they decided to go ahead and renounce the use of nuclear deterrence to protect me, I might look a little bit differently at things like NPT commitments thereafter, if indeed I felt threatened enough by the conventional military power of a resurgently belligerent Russia, or the sort of military colossus that China is trying to turn itself into these days. And that would become a much more challenging question. So I worry that we would also create proliferation pressures by such a move. So if I were, and I'm only me, but if I happen to be one of the United States nuclear umbrella allies, under those circumstances, I would be terrified by the prospect.
In light of that, let me turn around the question I was going to ask you about infrastructure. Is, instead of asking you what the views of our allies are, what's the best way to argue with our allies how the NNSA and nuclear infrastructure, as you point out, has been neglected for a long, long time? It is a very expensive portion of our nuclear enterprise. But as General Hyten said recently, without the warheads, the platforms don't really mean much. And there is going to be an argument about, do we do 30 pits a year? Do we move towards 80, which is the goal? Or some have argued we don't need any. But would you address what is, in your view, the most effective way to argue for the need for the modernization of our NNSA and our nuclear infrastructure, particularly with allies in mind?
Sure. I mean, I think the basic argument is simply the strategic one that I tried to outline, and the fact that it really does contribute really enormously powerful ways to deterrence itself, and therefore to preventing aggression, which presumably our allies who would be in the direct path of any such aggression would be keen to prevent. But understanding the political dilemmas that some of them face with their publics and legislatures, I think another additional point to make is the proliferation one that I made a moment ago. But then thirdly, the idea that having what we sometimes call a responsive nuclear infrastructure, that is to say, one that is robust and resilient and has enough sort of surge capacity to meet an emergent need if you should happen to have one. Having that sort of responsive capacity is not the same thing as actually using it. And in fact, if you have that capacity, you may need to use it less. I am less inclined to get into an arms race with you, Peter, if I know that you have a very impressive nuclear infrastructure with a considerable ability to produce things that would meet any threat that I could present to you. I might be more inclined to put you in that position if I thought you didn't, first of all. But also, you're possessing that capacity isn't an intrinsically belligerent or problematic thing. In this context, in many senses, it can be a way to help keep things from getting out of control because it avoids tempting people to do it. You may have that capacity, but I don't feel immediately threatened unless and until you start to churn out warheads and threaten me with those warheads. So you can have the capacity in a way that contributes to deterrence without being nearly such an acute potential provoker of action-reaction cycles in an arms race that having weapons in hand would be. And what we've been able to do for many years in the United States is get away with having fewer weapons in hand than we would otherwise want to have, by virtue of being able to produce them if we needed to. And so I don't think that principle works to the asymptote, but it is a really important thing to remember that having that kind of a responsive infrastructure allows us to have a smaller operational arsenal. And that is something that I think ought to be, I hope is, quite appealing to many of our allies. So that's a disarmament argument, in effect, for deterrence.
Would you go to the issue of, let's assume we put further reductions on the table, but we want to include theater systems, as well as the exotic systems that Mr. Putin has said, well, I've heard two things from the Russians. Yeah, some of them are under the New START treaty, but some are not. And there are contradictory views to that on Russia. You've been in this position where verification is critical, not only with respect to Russia or the major arms control deals, but with respect to proliferation in North Korea and in Iran. What have you learned? What can you tell us about the verification issues that are tough, that need to be resolved before we can also continue further arms control reductions or include theater systems, for example?
Well, I guess I would say one lesson is that, well, precisely because they are tough, there isn't any substitute for actually sitting down and talking to the other side about what range of options is in fact available as a practical matter. And that means there's no substitute for actual arms control negotiations. Sitting down with our Russian partners to talk about those details, sitting down with the Chinese to talk about some concept for how a future agreement might be verified. Those are essential. Because it may be, we could perhaps retreat into a appropriately well-informed and sealed off room and come up with a brilliant plan. Who knows? These are very technically challenging questions. But even if you come up with a brilliant plan, that's not all you need to do. You need to get the other side to agree that it is a brilliant plan and that the elements needed to implement that plan are in fact going to work, and that they are ones that all parties would be willing, in fact, to accept as applied to in their own context as well. There are lots of things I would love to see the Russians and the Chinese adopt that I probably couldn't persuade the United States Strategic Command to accept with some good reason. And surely that works the other direction as well. So the challenge is to find something that is both workable as a way to provide effective verification and of a nature in its actual concretized implementation that would be both negotiable and implementable by real world parties. And that's incredibly hard to do. And there's no way to answer those questions without sitting down and in fact engaging, which is why it's disappointing the Russians haven't been more willing to engage on this, although they've been far ahead of the Chinese. And it's just grotesque that the Chinese are contemptuous of even having these discussions. So I would say one of the answers is that it's not answerable unless and until you are in a kind of engagement that our counterparties have so far refused to have with us, which is unfortunate, but perhaps that's also another issue to watch for the next 4 years.
Let me go to my final issue, and that is what you raised with the JCPOA and Iran. We gave the Iranians a right to enrich, which we had not given anybody else in the world, with the exception of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And we also got rid of the arms embargo as part of the deal. Do you see any way to reverse both of those in an amended or new type of agreement with Iran, assuming Iran even agrees to some modification of the JCPOA, which I'm not assuming one way or the other, but there are some things I think we ought to go in with that, in my mind, don't make sense. One is no country has a right to enrich if they're not responsible partners. And number 2, Iran has been a major proliferator of ballistic missiles and weapons in Lebanon, in Syria, and Yemen, and in Iraq. So an arms embargo, in my mind, would seem to be the logical thing to continue, but the UN embargo went away. So can you address those 2 issues? Anything else you would like to talk about in terms of Iran, about what we can expect down the road?
Well, gosh, I wish I could answer all those questions in terms of what to expect or how to get, what the parameters of a new deal would look like. Let me say just a couple of quick things. First of all, when you say that the arms embargo went away, I think there are many countries who would agree with that statement. That isn't our position. When you actually read UN Security Council Resolution 2231, it provides that the countries that are identified therein as participants in the JCPOA have the right to invoke the snapback procedures spelled out in that resolution. And although we stopped participating in the deal, our lack of participation in the JCPOA didn't do anything retroactively to change the language of a legally binding Chapter 7 Security Council resolution, which cannot be done except by another superseding such resolution. So 2231 on its face provided a mechanism to invoke snapback even by us, and that's what we did earlier this year. So I think formally speaking, the arms embargo is in fact still, it's actually back to sort of 2014 level parameters. As indeed are all the nuclear restrictions on Iran. So even what it is doing, formally speaking, with its nuclear capacities now, I think as a matter of law, is unlawful.
Do you think the Russians and the Chinese are going to abide by an embargo?
An arms embargo? That's the question indeed. They emphatically take the position that none of what I just told you is true about the legal situation. But we have also made clear that, in effect, that even if you don't agree with our position on the law, you should pay attention to the fact that we have every intention to be very liberal in our application of sanctions remedies in the event that dangerous systems are in fact transferred to Iran. And so we hope that we may end up having to agree to disagree to some extent on the legal questions, but that's a second order question behind the really important substantive one of whether or not, in fact, they feed the Iranian threat. And I very much hope they will not do that. So far, so far we're okay. We'll see. That's a great question, and we'll have to see how it develops. And I hope that the new administration will keep the pressure on in that respect. I don't know anyone who, at least privately, doesn't think that keeping advanced systems out of Iran's hands is anything but an imperative. So I hope that they'll be willing to act on that imperative, as we have. And I hope that others will, even if they feel the need to bang the table and make their points one way or the other about UNSCR 2231. I hope that in practice, behavior will not in fact change from the pre-October 2020 situation.
Well, Chris, I want to thank you on behalf of the Mitchell Institute here in Washington, Arlington, Virginia, and our friends in Louisiana, the Cyber Innovation Center and the Louisiana Tech Research Institute. Your remarks were extraordinary. We hope you will be able to get your remarks posted, and we'll make them available to our audience on the 10th after they've listened to your remarks. Again, I can't thank you enough for taking the time out of your busy schedule for an extraordinary set of remarks, and my thanks to you personally as a friend and a colleague, and on behalf of the institutions that are part of this, including our friends at Global Strike Command, with whom we are doing this in a cooperative way. So again, Chris, thank you very much for your help on this and your remarks. We look forward to seeing you again.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks again so much. It's always great to do this, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Chris.